Thank you very much, Dion. Yes, celebrating 5 years now in this position. And obviously a lot of tie-overs with the work that UBC and the Coastal Douglas Fir folks are doing. I just want to acknowledge that it's a great privilege for me to be presenting today from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the land-based nations of the Semiahmoo, Kwantlen, and Katzie. Thank you very much. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the data gathering aspect of this, but more specifically through the community science lens. And we've sort of been at this particular initiative. It's a key component in regards to biodiversity conservation and monitoring, especially at the local level. So I'll focus on the work that's been happening here in Surrey and how that information and that data set is starting to get used when it comes to land use planning and all of the other sort of good, bad, and ugly components that come with having such a large amount of data surfacing for us. So I'm just going to give a bit of a refresh on the biodiversity conservation strategy in Surrey. It's always just part of ensuring that folks know the context for everything. I'll talk a little bit about how the data is being used. More specifically, I'm going to provide an example of a local neighborhood concept plan. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges with using that data. And then also more broadly, how we're engaging the community and how that information ideally is going to get used in the long term and some of the things that we need to consider and that other organizations need to consider who are starting to integrate this type of data. So as I said, just a bit of a refresh. The Biodiversity Conservation Strategy for Surrey is celebrating its 10th anniversary this fall. And it was really setting the stage for identifying biodiversity at the local level from a local government perspective and setting out the key roadmap for how that can be conserved both at the present time that the strategy was adopted by council, but also into the future. And it sort of has a 50-year time horizon in respect to trying to actualize on all of the goals and objectives. One of the key components to the strategy was the establishment of the Green Infrastructure Network. So this was the first time that an actual GIS-based layer was created that identified all of the connectivity corridors and major biodiversity hubs across the city. And those were the key elements that we use today through things like our sensitive ecosystem development permit area, to help trigger more informed decision-making around land use choices. And just for context, because the biodiversity conservation strategy itself had some predecessors, we started back in the 90s with an environmentally sensitive areas study. I'm not going to go into each one of these components over the last 10 plus years, but suffice to say that community science became one of the integrated tools that we started developing around 2019. So I had a background in using iNaturalist and integrating and engaging citizens and residents into gathering and monitoring, gathering data and using it for biodiversity monitoring before I started with the City of Surrey. And so that was one of the first things that I did back in 2019 was to get the City of Surrey created as a place within the iNaturalist platform. I won't go into too much detail about iNaturalist itself. Certainly happy to talk about that more in the question component or a little bit later on near the discussion. But we've definitely come forward quite a bit from that time that we started in 2019. And it has been part of a continuum in regards to how all of this is starting to fit together with delivering on the key recommendations from the strategy. One of the components that we need to be looking at, though, is what are we actually monitoring for? So we have been focused on native species and their habitat associations. And one of those things is to help us understand within that green infrastructure network, how are those species associated with those land-based habitat components and where are those populations distributed? And so we're using an indicator species approach. It's only focused on fauna I was always a bit intrigued by the fact that there were no plant indicator species. That's certainly something that, from a more current context, we should be looking at, because we obviously have a number of plant species which are very helpful as indicators. And we also have plant species that are listed as at risk, that we need to consider within places like the City of Surrey. But indicator species do help us measure changes in land use over time, what those impacts are having and what those particular decisions are having on the landscape, because we can ideally start to monitor the ebbs and flows in populations where particularly sensitive are occurring, and where they're not, which does tell a really important story. And ideally, we want to be using that information to help inform land use decision making. I'm located within the Parks Division, and I work interdepartmentally across the city for implementing the strategy. But obviously, all of the actions that the city undertakes, whether it's in protected areas like parkland, or through in-stream works, or planning and development, through development referrals, all of those particular actions have implementations for how biodiversity is actually doing across the city. We do use a species guild approach. So in different settings, you can use focal species or umbrella species. Our indicators are generally representative and associated with particular habitat types. So ideally, over time, we may take a look at maybe how well those species are actually giving us the proper message around biodiversity. But at this point in time, we have a set list of species. And those are just a few of the examples of species that are on the list in that slide. And of course, we need to be cognizant of the fact that all of these different species have different home range requirements. They have different mobility requirements and connectivity requirements. And they're not just staying within the City of Surrey. We are sandwiched between the township of Langley and the city of Langley, and the city of Delta. And we have species coming in from the north and across the border from the south, from Whatcom County. So we don't exist in a vacuum when it comes to indicator species and the monitoring for them. And one of the key things, though, even though we have all these species identified, is how much information do we actually have on where they occur and where they're moving around the landscape and when those populations may be located? And of course, the answer back in 2019 was it's really limited. We were really data deficient. We had a set of species to monitor, but we weren't necessarily monitoring them in an effective way. So community science has become probably one of the most significant tools to help fill those particular data gaps. Most local governments don't necessarily have the capacity to take on detailed monitoring and research activities, but we have a lot of residents, and the population for the City of Surrey is very close to the City of Vancouver's at this point in time. So we're talking about 600,000 plus people. And the majority of them are going to have things like smartphones or cameras, and they're using our landscape quite effectively, especially areas like green spaces and parks, as well as experiencing any little tiny postage stamp that they may have, whether it's a local boulevard or their balconies. People are interacting with nature in all shapes and forms, which means that they can actually help us track and monitor how species are doing or where they're occurring, and provide information that can help build our capacity around biodiversity monitoring. So this is just an example of when we started and how far we've come with this. As I said, we created our place in the iNaturalist universe in 2019. And when Surrey was first on the map, we had a couple of thousand observations. So this is 5 years ago, and we're now at 65,000 observations. And of course, a lot of that has been due to engagement with the public. We started our first City Nature Challenge at the beginning of the pandemic back in 2020, which actually worked out quite well because we had a lot of people who were accessing green space in a way that they never had before, because it was one of their few outlets just to basically get out during the pandemic. And people were becoming much more active in wanting to actually monitor the spaces around them. So we had a very successful first City Nature Challenge, and we've just completed our 5th City Nature Challenge this past April. And then back in 2019, we completed our first biodiversity blitz or bio blitz at one of our biodiversity preserves. And we just completed our second bio blitz, which celebrated the International Day for Biodiversity at Green Timbers Urban Forest and Park yesterday. And I know that at least one person who's on the session today actually participated in that. So shout out to Triana. Thanks very much for joining us yesterday. It was a great day, and just shows that these particular types of engagement processes can be very successful. And to visualize that data, this gives you an idea both within the City of Surrey and the adjacent municipalities, how that observational material has actually grown. So each one of those points represents an observation of plant, animal, or fungi. And you can see how that has grown along with the popularity of using community science type platforms. We do have eBird as well, but we're mainly focused on our naturalists because eBird is just focused on birds. And we're trying to work out a way eventually to try to integrate the data sets from both of them and eliminate some of the redundancies where people might be adding data to both of them. But this gives you an idea that we are getting a lot of data in. And of course, one of the key issues is how do we deal with all of that information? So this is one of our more recent land use planning processes that's going on in the City of Surrey. This is Annandale Tynehead. So the neighborhood itself is in that sort of arrow-shaped black boundary. And this is just a snapshot of an environmental assessment project that happened as part of that process. Where we're identifying specific environmentally sensitive habitats. And one of the things that I did with this particular map was I then overlaid all of the community science data that we had from my naturalist and saw how that correlated with some of the significant areas, whether it was streams or wetlands. Those were sort of the specific types of ecosystems that were getting identified for this. And also starting to look at where does the city's green infrastructure network sit with all of this, and where do we actually have existing protected areas, so parkland, including major biodiversity hubs, and where are we projecting the green infrastructure network and future parks to go within this particular neighborhood. So this is very telling because it gives us an idea as to whether or not the significance of the impacts that we're maybe having on the landscape. Of course, there's limitations that every municipality has with private land when it comes to how well we can deal with protecting species and habitat. One of the key things, though, is, and this is a huge issue for local governments across Canada, is how we deal with species at risk. So in this particular instance, I'm talking about species at risk under the Species at Risk Act. These are species that are scheduled, that have defined critical habitat, or they're special concern, so they have management plans. And this is just an example from work that UBC students did for us to add data points from community science, from my naturalist and eBird, where we actually had data around species at risk occurrences across the city. And then fast forward to an example that we have now where we've just had an updated version proposed for a species called the Oregon forest snail. We've basically gone from 2 locations in the city to dozens now of critical habitat. And that particular amended recovery strategy is going to be finalized probably later this summer. And this is an example of applying all of that new critical habitat data to that same neighborhood concept plan area in Annandale Tynehead. And of course, what we're seeing is that where critical habitat occurs may not necessarily be in areas that is protected. So it may be areas, as an example, that we want to acquire as part of the green infrastructure network, but we may not be able to because it's on private land and we may not have the acquisition funds to be able to do that, or the mechanisms to convey that in a dedicated fashion to the city. So again, all of this data is coming in, and some of the ways that the Oregon forest snail critical habitat data was updated was because of community science information coming in that both the province and federal government use to create new critical habitat polygons. So again, all this information coming in, the big challenge for us in regards to land use decision making is how are we dealing with all that information and how are we integrating it? So I want to sort of wrap up with the challenges and opportunity side of things. One key issue around community science is that it's often focused in spaces where the public have access to. It's not that we don't have folks on private land who are contributing information, whether it's their backyard or areas they may be trespassing on. And we don't normally try to figure that out when we look at private land data. But the key issue is it creating some sort of skewing of the data or biasing? Because you can see there's a lot of gaps in between. It doesn't mean that there aren't any species there or there aren't any indicator species there or species at risk. It just means that the bulk of the public as a mechanism through community science is going to be focused on areas that they can easily access or that they tend to want to access on a regular basis. We have to deal with the redundancy in the data. So as an example, a group of people may go out to a local park and they all see the same cool organism and they all take pictures of it and all upload it to iNaturalist. So iNaturalist as a tool has its limitations. It's very good for talking about species richness because you do get a really good idea as to the diversity of species that are located within a particular area. But it's not necessarily telling you anything about how healthy that population is or other types of dynamics that you may want to identify. It is useful for helping with connectivity modeling, and we are undertaking a connectivity modeling process right now with Simon Fraser University. So Erica is thinking about connecting you with the master's student who's doing that work for us. I think they're aware of the Biodiversity Atlas work that's happening, but it would be useful because they are also using training models for the work that they are doing. And then, of course, we get biased data about stuff that doesn't move. So plants and snails and slugs, really easy to photograph. Birds, probably our highest number of indicator species fall within the bird taxa, but the key issue is that birds are sometimes very easy or very difficult to get photographed. iNaturalist does allow for acoustic, so audio recordings, which is helpful. But we definitely see a bias in the data as to what people are capturing. And then things like fungi, which we should be looking at more closely, and because they are really critical to ecosystem health, are sometimes hard to identify. Same with the mosses and the lichens. So we get lots of photos of things that tend to not be easy to verify because we need really specialist expertise to help us do the identifications for those things. And then we have the other challenge with species getting misidentified, and iNaturalist uses machine learning. So unfortunately, if somebody verifies your wrong observation, the system thinks that it's correct, and then it can go on to replicate those incorrect IDs later on. So we really rely on people to sort of self-monitor and check the locations of a species and not just default to whatever iNaturalist tells them it is, to ensure that they do a little bit of homework before they try to assign something to a genus or species level. Usually it's like, if you're not sure, stick with the family and reach out to the thousands of folks out there who are actually specialists in these particular organisms who can help you ID it more accurately. I can say that we are getting starting to move down in regards to observations that are mistaken identity or are casual and need help. More and more observations are getting to research grade or getting verified, which is really important for the robustness of the data. And then specifically capacity, and I mentioned this is not something that a lot of local governments typically invest in when it comes to research and monitoring. So internally, we have this voluminous amount of data now. So how are we going to effectively use it? Because obviously it just can't be me curating this all the time. We need to think a little bit long-term and bigger picture as to how we use this information. I do want to say that one of the key benefits of having become heavily invested in community science is that it has created a mechanism for us to engage with the public in a very effective way. And for me to be working with different staff and getting them more keenly involved as observers when they're out there. And it can be very rewarding, and it's generally a safe sort of social media type of interaction on these particular community science platforms. People are very helpful and caring towards one another, and they learn a lot. It's not quite as dark as things like X or Facebook. I wish that iNaturalist actually had more of the functionality of some of the social media platforms, but that's probably something that will come in the future. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that the data doesn't always tell us a positive story. So one of the key things, though, is it's helping us identify where we might have things like roadkill hotspots. And vehicle wildlife conflicts are a really key element. Same with bird collision data, where birds are hitting buildings or windows. Finding out where those hotspots are, and then it's like, okay, so what are we going to do about this, as a local government? Because we have the ability to start focusing on mitigating these types of things. But again, has not been something that's been on the radar for local decision makers up until now. And then, of course, how well are we going to curate all of this information and integrate it, make sure that it remains robust? I know there's been a lot of research papers that have come out looking at community science data and verifying that it is actually a credible source of information. Although sometimes I know some of my scientific colleagues can be a little dismissive about that. But if you delve into it, you start to realize that it's a really engaging and valuable component to help us make better and informed land use decisions. So that's it for me. Thank you very much, and looking forward to having a discussion on this.
Thanks so much, Pam. It's great.
I just need to stop sharing. Sorry, did it stop sharing?
Yes. No, it's still sharing. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I think we have one question from Tara. Tara, do you want to speak?
Hi, Pam. Thank you so much. I liked your screen shaver over there with the bunnies. That was cute. I was just curious about sort of the relationship between what you're talking about, is the critical habitat info, and how it differs, aligns, or doesn't with the SEI info. And maybe you could just speak a little bit about that.
So not SEI info. Actually, that might be a question for Lori, because I don't know if for the Regional Green Infrastructure Network and SEI, if they've been looking at layering those things together. But for us in the City of Surrey, with our Green Infrastructure Network, one of the things over time that ideally we should be looking at, and this is where I come in when it comes to being involved in either the neighborhood concept planning or land use planning, or the development referral process, is raising that flag, saying, hey, there's critical habitat here. We know that critical habitat mapping is getting updated. The Oregon forest snail is a good example. It was quite a shocker when I got the amended strategy at the beginning of May and looked at all the polygons and realized, because I'm named in that amended strategy, so realized that a lot of the updated work came from contributions by myself and others who have recently been going out there and looking at those habitat associations. And so the challenge is there hasn't really been an analysis done other than anecdotally each time something crops up where we're concerned about critical habitat on private land, whether or not the Green Infrastructure Network matches. And to be fair, the Green Infrastructure Network was a static layer that was created in 2014, and it precedes a number of recovery strategies and critical habitat mapping. So generally they should align, but things like connectivity corridors may not, because our connectivity corridors run along roads and other areas, which may not at this present time provide the best connectivity for certain types of species.
Thanks, Pam. I think there's another question from Andrew.
Yeah, you mentioned connectivity. I was curious about Lepus americanus washingtoni. I can't help but ask you about this, Pam, because we've had some correspondence about it. Just how's it doing? Yeah, wondering how it's doing, and does that rabbit figure as an indicator species at all in this context?
No. And as far as I know, I mean, it's not that it's, of course, for me, so Tara, one of the reasons why I had hares on my screensaver was because it's always been a really important animal for me spiritually, but also I did some work on our Washingtoni snowshoe hare, which is our native hare species here on the South Coast. It doesn't turn white in the winter like other snowshoe hares. So in regards to Surrey, I scan every single lagomorph that gets added to iNaturalist. They're all Eastern Cottontails so far, and that seems to be our most populous bunny. We get the odd European rabbit, you know, feral rabbits that are out there. But yeah, I've kept my eye out. We have some suitable habitat definitely within Surrey. Historically, they were in Burns Bog, and we're not that far from Burns Bog. But to date, there hasn't been anything, although I know that historically there were populations sort of in the Aldergrove, like the Huntington area, and definitely farther east in the Fraser Valley. So yeah, it's a little holy grail out there. Maybe we'll find one. Sorry, Andrew, to disappoint. But
I think there's one more question in the chat from Paul Chapman. Paul, would you like to ask your question, or do you prefer me to read it out?
Sure, I can ask. Yeah, just sometimes there's a difference between the expectations of what volunteer participation will result in and what volunteers are willing to do. So I'm just wondering, because you don't want to make the requirements too onerous to bar volunteer participation, what do you do to verify their observations?
well, this is the challenge. So right now it's me most of the time curating it. But I will say that, actually, I'm just going to go back. Sorry, you won't be able to see this, but to the stats. So we have a number of volunteer programs within the City of Surrey. That's a whole other presentation. And so we've been really urging the community science component as part of that. And we have the Surrey Youth Stewardship Squad. We have our Surrey Natural Areas Partnership and our Surrey Habitat and Restoration, Salmon Habitat and Restoration Program. So one's parks, one's engineering. And both of those are youth employment programs. And so we do urge as part of that, they get sort of training sessions on community science as part of the work that they're doing out there for each particular department. And then with the youth programs and the volunteer programs, we do try to highlight community science quite a bit. So we do know that there are a lot of observations coming in from these particular programs, but also from the public in general, and then through volunteer activities. And to help with the identifications. Dion, are you getting okay audio? I'm just going to turn my camera off because I'm getting an unstable connection.
Yeah, we just missed one word, but we can hear you
Okay.
pretty well. Thanks.
All right, so hopefully this will be better. So we've gone from back in 2019 to 662 identifiers helping with City of Surrey data to close to 4,000 identifiers. So these are folks out there, many of whom are more recent to the iNaturalist community themselves. Many of them are specialists. Some of them are students in post-secondary studying particular areas of research. And others are folks that have been specialists in various taxa for decades. So when I'm going through, and maybe it's once a week, it's really kind of a full-time job to curate this type of data, given the amount of information that we now have. I try to go through as much as possible just to do engagement with folks and then try to look for the anomalous ones. So I use the filtration system, which iNaturalist has. So I go through various taxa. So I'll start with things like the amphibians, then the reptiles, and I sort of do the birds and the plants last, because those are like high volumes of data that we may be getting in. But it's the ones that I know want to keep an eye out, especially for species at risk. And getting back to the conversation with Andrew, other species that may be of conservation concern. And I'm looking through those on a regular basis. But definitely those 4,000 identifiers out there have been a huge help. And the increasing number of folks that I can tag to help with ID has been really important. I do try to look for the anomalous ones. So if it's an outlier, like a really unusual species, and that's where I'm checking the maps to see whether or not they've just gone with what iNaturalist suggested, even though it doesn't even occur in BC, let alone North America. And that's where I engage with the observer to let them know that the identification is likely incorrect. And it's probably within this particular family, or if I'm confident that it's this particular genus or species. But other people out there do the same, which is vitally important. So we're never going to be quite ahead of everything, but definitely the gap has been closing over the last 5 years or so.
We're running out of time, and so we have one more question. Maybe we can if we could quickly address that and move on to the next. It's from Hafsa. Hafsa, would you like to quickly ask the question? Or should I?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Pamela. That was a great presentation. I'm curious to know how Surrey is planning to address the potential habitat loss with the new provincial housing legislation that's coming on pretty soon.
I don't have an answer for you on that. I think all local governments are in a quandary right now. There's definitely been a lot of media articles out there around things like tree cover loss and urban forest canopy loss. We have our sensitive ecosystem development permit area, which is triggered by the GIN and water courses. I think the biggest challenge for us is, aside from those particular mechanisms, is dealing with species at risk and critical habitat. And I think all local governments are challenged by that because we do not have standalone legislation in this province. And we're waiting to see what the province is going to do if they get reelected, because that seems to be the message with the biodiversity and ecosystem health framework, because they've said that that is probably where things related to species at risk are going to happen. When it comes to habitat loss, we work within the powers that we have and are enabled to do. And I think that's important to recognize. I came from outside of government when I came into this job, and prior to working for government, I worked with many of the same people that I work with now, both within Surrey and with other local governments. And I was always pushing for more. But, you know, it's a bit of a reality check when you're working within the system to recognize that you don't necessarily have the legislative tools to empower you and enable you to protect the things that you might feel need to be protected, especially on private land. So I have no quick answer for you. I wish I did. I don't think any local government does at this point in time.
Thank
I would
you.
suggest that you actually pose that question to the province. How are they going to enable local governments to effectively protect habitat, given all of the various legislative changes that have happened?